Mr. President, I want to thank my colleague from Rhode Island, as well as those who were on the floor earlier. The remarks that we're delivering today address the future of our relationship with the NATO alliance, and particularly in light of the visit that President Trump is now making to meet with Vladimir Putin of Russia. I'm glad that many of my colleagues came here today to speak on the threats posed by President Trump to America's core national security alliance, something that would have once been unimaginable. In fact, there was a time when a Republican president named Ronald Reagan really inspired the United States and the world by noting how important the NATO alliance is to the world and to the United States. In a speech which he gave to the Parliament of Great Britain in 1982, Ronald Reagan said, "We're approaching the end of a bloody century plagued by a terrible political invention, totalitarianism. Optimism comes less easily today, not because democracy is less vigorous, but because democracy's enemies have refined their instruments of repression. Yet optimism is in order," President Reagan said, "because day by day, democracy is proving itself to be a not at all fragile flower." Reagan went on to say, "Our military strength is a prerequisite to peace, but let it be clear that we maintain this strength in the hope it will never be used. For the ultimate determinant in the struggle that's now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of will and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve, the values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated." President Reagan then went on to say to the British Parliament, "I've often wondered about the shyness of some of us in the West about standing for these ideals that have done so much to ease the plight of man and the hardships of our imperfect world." Now contrast what President Reagan said about the partnership of Atlantic Alliance nations and NATO with what has happened with this current White House and President regarding some of these same key Western allies at the G7 summit last month. First, President Trump stunned the Western world by saying, even before arriving at the summit, that Russia should be welcomed back into the group of G7 nations, even though Russia was expelled after invading and seizing sovereign Ukrainian territory, which it still holds. President Trump made this plea to try to win over this effort of support for Putin to a Western world that is skeptical of Putin and his tactics. Putin launched an aggressive cyber act of war right here in the United States in an attempt to void and change a national election and to favor his candidate over another. That, in many respects, is a cyber act of war, which President Trump refuses to acknowledge. At the summit itself, President Trump arrived late and left early after letting it be known that he didn't even want to attend the G7 summit with our traditional allies. The president, sad to say, was utterly disrespectful to our nation's oldest and most reliable allies. In fact, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro said of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that he had, quote, "stabbed us in the back." And then Mr. Navarro went on to say, "There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door." Navarro's comments echoed a series of tweets from the president, withdrawing from a joint G7 statement after initially agreeing to it. Then he went on in his tweets, the president did, personally attacking Prime Minister Trudeau in the coarsest terms and criticizing and disparaging America's oldest Western allies simply for imploring him not to end decades of shared Western-led international order and cooperation. One senses that President Trump's sense of history extends to the day before yesterday. Has he forgotten that since the attack on the United States on 9/11, the Canadians have stood by us as so many other countries have as well? 159 Canadians have given their lives standing by our troops in Afghanistan in a NATO effort since operations began there in 2002. Could we ask anything more of a trusted ally than to sacrifice the lives of its young soldiers? Canada has and continues to, despite this language from President Trump. And then, to add insult to injury, President Trump showered one of the world's most brutal, nuclear-armed dictators with glowing warmth, pats on the back, flattery, and even a White House-made propaganda video showing North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as a great statesman. Can anyone here imagine what would have happened if President Obama had constructed a propaganda video before beginning his negotiations with Iran, or if the president had saluted an Iranian general? Fox TV, the Republicans, and many other leaders would have had a field day with that image. Mr. President, I am all for talking to one's adversaries and the pursuit of diplomacy. I've met with my share of autocrats around the world, trying in my small way to advance America's interests and values. But I don't check America's values or reality at the door at those meetings. I do not know of any modern president who let normal disagreements between key allies turn into a personal spat that alienates our friends and undermines our security. In fact, I'm increasingly convinced that President Trump is so enamored by validation-seeking autocrats and offended by our traditional allies expressing disagreements that he's incapable of distinguishing friends from enemies. This is truly problematic and dangerous. And now our allies have just cause to worry that President Trump will give away concessions to Vladimir Putin, just as he did with the North Korean dictator. Against all reason and international norms, Trump is considering recognizing Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea because, sadly, President Trump has no sense of history and little knowledge of Vladimir Putin's true agenda. He is making threats and belittling NATO, the strongest alliance on the face of the earth, while at the same time craving time with Vladimir Putin, whom he describes as a fine man. That is something which I'm sure the people in our NATO alliance find incredible. Quite simply, the first and long overdue statement from Trump to Putin ought to be, do not interfere in America's elections ever again. I don't want your help, which was an attack on our democracy, and I do not believe your denials. That ought to be the opening remark with Vladimir Putin. My guess is it won't even be close. Mr. President, I can think a few times in history that the party of Ronald Reagan has sat so quietly on its hands while an American president's actions threaten our Western security alliance and our place in the world. I don't understand why the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has not held a full committee hearing on Russia in more than 1 year, not to mention ever conducted an investigation into Russia's attack on our last election, something clearly within the jurisdiction of this committee, in which it did in the past amid allegations of foreign election interference. What of the Republicans' stunning silence about President Trump's undermining of NATO? There are some national needs and congressional responsibilities which ought to call on all of us in both political parties to rise to the occasion. Mr. President, think about what Russian President Putin would most likely like to see happen in the West and compare it to what's happening under President Trump. President Trump has called NATO obsolete, questioned the centrality of the collective security guarantee of Article 5. He's questioned whether NATO should come to the aid of Baltic NATO states, NATO members. In fact, President Trump reportedly asked of NATO at the recent G7, why do we need it? Is that now the official position, not just of President Trump, but his Republican Party? I would implore those members of the Senate of both political parties who have visited the Baltic nations and understand the vulnerability of those states and their bloody history over the last century and a half, to speak up on behalf of the need for NATO, to stand in concert and in alliance with those Baltic states. This week, the Canadians sent their forces and representatives to Latvia, where they are providing special help on the ground. Similar NATO forces are in Lithuania and Estonia. They are doing their best to convince Putin not to engage in acts of aggression against these small nations, while at the same time, the President of the United States questions the purpose of this effort. President Trump has withdrawn the United States from key international agreements on trade, climate, and even the expansion of nuclear weapons in Iran. In doing so, the President has estranged the United States from its allies. And while I hope we do reach a diplomatic agreement with North Korea, I want to note that what little was agreed to in Singapore doesn't even come close to the terms and inspections that were in the Iran nuclear agreement from which President Trump simply walked away. President Trump has insulted and strained relations with America's closest European and Western allies, so much so that the European Council President Donald Tusk recently dismissed the United States by saying, quote, "With friends like that, who needs enemies?" End of quote. It has reached the point that just ahead of the NATO summit, we lost another senior career diplomat when James Melville, our ambassador to Estonia, resigned over frustration with the controversial comments being made by President Trump. Ambassador Melville served under 6 different presidents, 11 secretaries of state, and never thought the day would come when he couldn't support a president's policies, until now. President Trump has tried to discredit key democratic institutions and processes in the United States, sowing mistrust in our political system and government. He has insulted poor nations, made immigrants a manufactured enemy, separated children from parents forcibly, and declared that America must come first in this world, isolating the United States day by day more and more from the nations and countries that have been our traditional allies. Why in the world is this president pursuing the agenda of one of our adversaries who attacked our election process, militarily seized sovereign territory of our allies, murdered and attempted to murder dissidents on our allies' soil, provided weapons to Ukrainian separatists that shot down a Malaysian commercial airliner, killing hundreds of innocent people, repeatedly buzz and test NATO defenses, and jail and repress its own people when they advocate for basic democratic rights. Before departing this morning for Brussels, instead of setting a positive tone for the NATO meeting to follow, President Trump incredibly decided to take to Twitter to criticize our allies again. My friend and an American patriot, Senator John McCain, was one of the few Republicans, to recently speak up on behalf of our alliance. Here's what he said: "To our allies, bipartisan majorities of Americans remain pro-free trade, pro-globalization, and supportive of alliances based on 70 years of shared values. Americans," Senator McCain said, "stand with you, even if our president doesn't." Mr. President, I couldn't agree more. I wish John McCain were on the floor of the Senate today to deliver those remarks in person. But his spirit is here among those on both sides of the aisle who value our NATO alliance and cannot understand the relationship between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. The cause of democracy and freedom in this world requires a strong alliance that stands together for values the Americans believe in, share, fight for, and die for in war after war. We need that spirit to return again to the United States. I yield the floor.